Hi, I'm Renee Williams,
And I'm Billy Thomas.
and welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. And we have our spooktacular event today. So
You
we
know,
thank you for joining us.
yeah, it's really exciting. This is also our first time debuting live on YouTube. So for all of you all on YouTube, welcome to From the Woods Today. You may have seen some of our videos in the past, but you're live with us today. So Renee, I'm really excited about today's kind of spooky show,
I
right?
know we have creepy things from our forest.
I know we got all kinds of them. We got three of our favorite guests. We've got Dr. Jonathan Larson, our resident entomologist over here. He's going to be talking about some of those creepy insects that we might find out there. We've got Dr. Matt Springer talking about some of those creepy things you'll see also. And Dr. Ellen Crocker is going to be talking about zombies.
Zombies.
Yeah, anyway, we'll have to see what Dr. Crocker's got to say about that. So
Exactly.
yeah.
So thank you for joining us. And you can put any comments that you have in the chat pod if you are on Zoom, or you can just email us at forestry.extension at uky.edu if you're on YouTube. And we will try to get those answered. So let's go ahead and get started. With the creepy edition.
No doubt. Yes. Welcome, welcome.
So Jonathan, if you would like to come on.
Howdy.
Today?
Hey, Dr. Larson.
Feeling spooky. I was thinking about maybe like kid kind of emotion when I showed up. I'm excited to be here with you today. I appreciate the chance to talk about some spooky things. Renee, you kind of inspired or a big chunk of this. You asked me specifically to speak on leeches this year.
I did. Well, blood sucking, it just kind of made sense.
Do you have a fear of leeches?
No.
Okay.
I might now after your presentation.
No, hopefully not. So before I pop myself up, I do want to say, it's not necessarily a content warning. I tried to keep it mostly PG-13, but there are some images of dead organisms in my slides, and there's a little bit of blood on some of the slides. So, I mean, if that stuff makes you squeamish, just keep that in mind as we kind of go through it. But if you're watching the spooky show,
right?
yeah, if you're watching the spooky show, I assume you're kind of ready for that.
You're okay with it, yeah.
Right.
So I'm gonna go ahead and pop that up. There we go. So spooky entomology in the woods today. A bit of a misnomer, perhaps, because we're going to start by talking about leeches, which are not insects at all. They are annelids, which is a large group of animals that we have here on planet Earth. They're probably best known as the segmented worms, if you were going to use kind of a common name for them. And that means that leeches are very closely related to our much more famous earthworms, the things that sometimes people consider to be kind of cute and cuddly and important in the landscape. I think these two images that I picked here, they kind of highlight those parallels in their physiology. If you look closely at both of these species here, the earthworm, you can see that definite segmentation to their body that allows for that great kind of wormy flexibility that they're famous for. You see it paralleled there on the leech. So both of them are kind of ringed in appearance. Further, it's hard to see on the leech, but they do have a clitellum, that sort of ringish structure that we see on the earthworm on the left, that kind of rises up out of the rest of the skin. That's part of the mating process. We see these on the leeches as well. They don't have exoskeletons like insects. There's no legs on these worms, on these annelids, and so they don't belong with the arthropods that I normally work with. But I will say, as an entomologist, these are often sort of part of our purview. We are gifted all of the squirmy and wormy and weird kind of in my neck of the woods. So we often end up talking about earthworms. We often end up talking about leeches. With earthworms, people want to conserve them. But more broadly, I would say there's been a lot of questions recently about problematic earthworms. People may have heard of invasive species of earthworms, things like the jumping worm or the stinkworm. That would be a whole other kind of horror show that we could show on a creepy episode. But for today, we're going to focus in more on the vampiric horror that we see with the leeches. So there are some key differences in the overall biology. Earthworms are decomposers. They are segmented and everything, but they perform a very different role in the environment. Earthworms live down in the soil. They are feeding on organic matter that's there and returning nutrients to the soil. Leeches, on the other hand, as we see demonstrated in this image, they're hematophagous parasites in many cases. Others are predators. I think that's an important distinction to make, that not all leeches are bloodsuckers. Others are more active kind of ambush predators. They're not as famous as their parasitic kin, and I couldn't find quite as many photographs of them in action. But these predaceous leeches, they are often kind of sit and wait, and they will see something that kind of wanders up to them, and then they leap at it, seemingly, and they plunge their proboscis into it. The proboscis in the parasitic species we'll talk about is inserted to suck out juices. In this case, it's sort of more like a spear, it seems. And so when they jump and attack these things, they will stab them, and then they kind of slurp their prey up almost whole. There are some species that pull out juices sort of similar in fashion to the parasitic kind, but others, like this one that has the snail kind of by the bottom, they're going to just start like sucking it up whole, which to me sounds like a very horrifying sight. I was hoping to find a video, but I couldn't find one that really went into a lot of detail. I did want to point out that on the right here, this sort of a Getty Images photo or whatever that I stole, this is a leech that has, according to the caption I read at least, it has a newt immature or a salamander immature in its mouth, and it's feeding on it. So they're most famous for feeding on small, soft-bodied critters like snails, earthworms, and insect larvae, but apparently have been recorded even feeding on vertebrates. The parasitic leeches that are kind of most famous and that people are most concerned with, these are going to be encountered in calm and shallow waters, usually in ponds and lakes. So we're not quite in the woods, though we can see these bodies of water in our wooded areas. One reason that I think that this is important for a show that's associated with forestry is that they like to live in areas of the water that are full of debris. So pieces of forestry material like leaf litter, logs, limbs, and things like that that fall into the water. These become excellent hiding places. They also like rocks and other spots, but they like to be in these kind of debris-filled spots, these kind of riparian zones, I guess you could say, where there's going to be lots of options for food, lots of nooks and crannies to kind of tuck themselves into. They don't really like to be exposed to the light, sounding more and more vampiric as we go here, I would argue. And they're going to sit there and wait for a host to wander by so that they can go to it and feed. Now, most of the leeches we deal with here in Kentucky, they're not going to be too extreme looking. They are usually around 1 to 2 inches long. It is important to note that in all of the literature that I read, many of the scientists that work with leeches, they seem to argue that they're hard to measure just because they are going to expand so much as they feed. But in their unfed form, you're usually talking 1 to 2 inches long. There are recorded instances of leeches that live in the United States that after feeding have reached up to 17 inches in length. There is an Amazonian species, which you can see in the image on the right. This is from the Wikipedia page on this critter. They're about 17 to 20 inches long. So that's a pretty extreme leech. I know that I've had leeches in the past, just kind of wandering through and sampling for dragonfly nymphs and things like that, or going swimming back home in Indiana. And it's always like this little black blob. You find it on your body. Sometimes they have spots or speckles. I think I have always reacted pretty calmly. It's just been like, oh, that's weird, you know, a leech, kind of nature's weirdness. But if I was down in the Amazon and I got a 20-inch long leech on my ankle, there might be some curse words said. I don't really know, but that's definitely one that would be cause for some alarming language, perhaps. One of the things that I think is really neat about leeches is the way they locomote. So leeches on each end of their body, they have a sucker-like structure, kind of a suction cup, which you can see pressed up against glass here. The sucker on the thinner end, which is the head end, that's the end that feeds. But both of the suckers are very important to the leech's success. They're able to grip surfaces with both of them and then perform this looping behavior. This is interesting to me as an entomologist because we have looper caterpillars, soybean looper, cabbage looper, and they get their name from this kind of loping action where they bunch their body up and then move one piece ahead and then scrunch up again. Some people call these inchworms because of the way that they move. So that's how these leeches actually get around. It's very similar in regards to the looper caterpillars. And I just think that's kind of a fun way to move through the water. Now, this is where we start to get into some of the gross stuff, I guess. When they feed, they latch on to their host, in some cases a human, in other cases a turtle, or whatever other animal they can find kind of wandering through their habitat. And there's a suction cup on the tail end, as I mentioned. There's mucus that's there. It helps to suction cup one end of them to the host, and then they flop the other end onto the skin. And there's some suction cupping that goes on there, even some teeth that can be exuded from deep down in the digestive tract that help them to kind of latch on. They haven't actually classified it yet, but it is assumed that there's a numbing agent that comes with the saliva, but it is known that they inject the host's body with a blood thinner so that the blood will freely flow and they're able to slurp it up with their long tongue, their proboscis. Leeches will feed to contentment. That varies by size and by species, but they can swell up, very similar to a tick. Most people don't know that they've ever been fed on. There may be a small wound when the leech disengages, so they usually silently kind of disengage their mouth part and slip off the host back into the water while you're swimming. Sometimes these are discovered on land and they get ripped off, but usually there's not much of a wound left behind. Some people may think that they bumped their knee or sort of scraped their arm or leg while they were down in the water. Most people have no idea that this has occurred when they actually get fed on. Most leech bites will pose a little problem for people if we experience them. There are folks that have exhibited anaphylactic reactions to leech injections, so the stuff that they're putting in us to increase their ability to feed. I would argue that leeches should be kind of low on the list of things that you worry about that can get on your body and suck out your blood. I would rank it probably ticks, mosquitoes, and then leeches if I was going to do it. You could maybe fit in things like fleas and lice in there if you wanted to get a little fancy. But just in terms of nature, I would be far more worried about ticks than I would be the leeches. They're not known to provide an opportunity for vectoring. It is known that it takes them a long time to digest their blood meals, but they don't seem to be able to keep the different pathogens inside of them and move them from host to host. There's a lack of evidence of this occurring in the field. The other thing with people is that we are going to notice them, right? You get out of the water, you go to dry off with your flamingo towel, and you're going to notice this like banana-shaped, 6-inch long, weird slug thing that's sucking your blood out of your body, and we pick them off. So we tend to be safe. It's animals out in nature that are not able to get them off or that are in the water a lot, that are amphibious or fully aquatic. They're not going to be as liable to get these off. So there are cases, especially with marine leeches, where there can be extreme blood loss and even death because of infestation by them. However, just because I'm arguing this doesn't mean that they haven't got a hold of kind of our popular imagination. There are lots of different examples of leeches in pop culture. I found 2 movies that I wanted to highlight. The 1950s movie Attack of the Giant Leeches. These are 2 men in giant rubber suits with leech mouths on the front that look vaguely more like a lamprey eel, and they're looking to feed on young flesh and devour the blood from them. This other one, Leeches, from 2003 or 4, if I remember correctly, from the Internet Movie Database. It is a very strange movie. Apparently, there's a bunch of swimmers that are taking anabolic steroids, and they're swimming outside, trying to get prepped for swimming season, and they feed leeches their anabolic steroid-laden blood, and the leeches grow to extreme sizes. And then there's like some shenanigans where they're trying to, I guess, fool around with these teenagers in the lake, and then the leeches get all of them. So they do have like a cultural connotation with people. They're thought of as these vampiric creatures. They want our blood. Leech is often used as even sort of a derogatory term. We talk about people as leeches when they're kind of stealing from us. I think this is something of a holdover from their history as a medical tool. The word leech etymologically, I'm an entomologist. Etymologists are the people who study words. They would tell you that leech comes from an old German word, which is actually used for doctors. Doctors used to be called leeches because they often used leeches as part of bloodletting treatments. This has been done for thousands of years. It obviously fell out of vogue in the early 1900s, but it was used even on people like President George Washington. I remember reading different accounts of him having bloodletting done through leeches. They can still be deployed in modern medicine. Usually this is done in conjunction with the reattachment of a limb, like a finger or an arm or a hand. The leeches will be put onto the reattached organ in order to try and help increase blood flow or to check for blood flow there, I should say. When I was researching this, I also found that they're advertised as helping with varicose veins. There was a baldness treatment that involved leeches and a whole host of other problems. I did not see any verifiable data to sort of attest to the veracity of these claims, but it is important to note that leeches are out there. This image that you see here is actually from a National Geographic article that described a man who was caught with 5,000 leeches in his luggage. He was smuggling them as part of a medical treatment scheme. So it is still something that occurs in the world today. That is sort of a vampiric angle from the world of squirmy, wormy things. I wanted to go with another couple of angles. One was a body horror angle. I've recently rewatched Alien, and so this was kind of in my mind as I was prepping for today. And because of that, I wanted to highlight the squirrel botfly. Here we can see a squirrel. You may notice that it looks a little bit bedraggled. And if you look closely kind of around its shoulder area, you may see these large tumor-like structures. Many people call these warbles. Squirrel warbles are sort of a cultural thing that we talk about here in Kentucky and in the South. These are found on squirrels and chipmunks. And if we look closely at what this is, it's actually the home of a maggot. So squirrel botflies, they are known by their scientific name, Cutibora emasculator. This is because originally when they were discovered here in the US, the people that first described them, they listened to some folk tales that told that the maggot that you see in these images, it actually bore into the male's male anatomy, and that it would clip off the testes and devour them from squirrels. And so, of course, that's terrifying. Men all over the world will squinch and hide in fear from that idea. And so that's how they got their scientific name. That's actually quite inaccurate. The truth is that the maggot lives below the skin area in this species. They induce the squirrel to create the warble around them, and they feed on lymph fluid and cellular debris as it flows through. You'll notice that they do have hooks that they can anchor themselves with, and then their body is covered in backward-facing spines, which makes removal very difficult. The botflies are very famous for this behavior. There are species in South America and Central America that are associated with getting in cattle and humans. We don't have human-infesting bots here in Kentucky. So those of you who are watching from the bluegrass, you don't need to worry about this happening to you. Adult botflies are very interesting looking. They have a really large head and kind of a broad facial area, and then large eyes. It gives them something of a puppy dog appearance. Maybe some of you would argue the point with me, but they're known for their kind of stout stature and large eyes. The dipterists that I have interviewed for my podcast and others, this is always their example of the cutest fly. Things like sheep bots and squirrel bots are held up as representative cute flies. Again, some of you may not fully agree with that assessment, but I do think they have kind of a baby-like face. The adults, though, aren't often seen with this species. The female is believed in early summer to lay her eggs on twigs. They hatch out, and then the maggots are kind of waiting around. And when a squirrel or a chipmunk wanders by, they climb aboard and they will enter the squirrel's body through the nose or the ear or a wound. And then they kind of circulate through the body for a bit, and then they eventually come to rest beneath the hide of the squirrel. They'll cut a breathing hole there, and then the squirrel's body reacts by forming that warble around it. So the maggot is inside feeding, and it's walled off inside of the warble, basically by the I guess the, what is it that I'm trying to say? The reaction of the squirrel, I guess, the not allergic reaction, but sort of just the body's sort of immune reaction. Thank you, brain, for remembering finally of what they're trying to do. So they have this immune reaction where they wall it off. The insect feeds inside, breathes through the hole that it's made. Eventually they want to pupate. So they'll feed for about 3 to 4 weeks. They will back out of the breathing hole. That's what you're watching here. And they'll crawl off and pupate in the soil. They don't impact humans directly, as I said. They don't infest us. It's not going to get in you if you accidentally eat one or anything like that. But squirrel hunters are known to discard their infested quarry. This has led to adjustments in squirrel season timing in order to try and cut down on waste. You kill the squirrel, you see all these warbles, you get rid of the squirrel. We don't want to waste things that we have hunted down. So there have been some adjustments to that. Maybe when I finish up, Matt can talk about if he's had any experiences with botflies here this season or over the last few years. But I did want to finish up and talk about another interesting spooky specimen. This is something that I would argue you kind of have to go to the graveyard for, so to speak. The insect that you're seeing in the center of the slide here, this is the American burying beetle. I think it's a very handsome beetle, a nice kind of bright aposematic coloration, beautiful lamellate antenna that pick up a lot of chemical cues from the environment. This is just one representative species of the burying beetle group, which is a genus that's inside of a larger family of beetles that are called the carrion beetles. So carrion being dead animal flesh. Burying beetles are specific and different than other carrion beetles, and they get their name from their mating behavior. It's very epic, actually. What happens is that there will be a dead bird or dead mouse, and the chemical signals that are signaling death are leaking into the air. That will attract flies and other things, but it also attracts these burying beetles, and they will arrive in droves and then fight. They actually pair up by sex, so males fight males, females fight females, and then the winning pair actually gets to mate with one another. They pair up as champions. They get married on top of the dead critter that they have discovered, and they claim that host for themselves. They will then take the dead creature and they start to dig below it, and they slowly sort of squish it and form it into a ball. And they're kind of drooling all over it at the same time and getting it prepped for their larva. The newlyweds will strip the fur and the feathers off of the host. They line the hole, the burrow, the tunnel that they're constructing. It adds for structural integrity. But at the center will be this kind of carcass nugget that they have produced. They can lay their eggs directly on top of it or in a nearby tunnel, and then the resulting larva will hatch out. And then what's interesting with this group is that the parents of these larvae stick around. They perform a type of parental behavior. They will watch over the larva, and they look for cues where the larva needs to feed, and they will chew up food and regurgitate it into the mouths of their larvae. So the larvae live inside of the carcass. They are feeding on the carcass. Sometimes they need some help. And so the parents perform this bit of similar to birds, I guess you could say, where they regurgitate the food into their mouth. So chew up on the carrion and kind of puke it into your kid's mouth. That's an apt description. The parents are also believed to be able to secrete antimicrobial liquids. It keeps the carrion fresher for longer. So they're kind of a living refrigerator. They're able to keep the stuff around longer so that their kids can have a longer period to eat. Burying beetles are some of the only non-bee or ant insect species to exhibit any type of parenting behavior. So I would argue that what you're looking at here are the best beetle dads and moms ever. They're very special in the insect world because of this behavior. The American burying beetle that I brought up at first is also important. It's one of the few federally recognized endangered insects. We don't have a ton of insects, not in ratio with their biodiversity, that are on the endangered species list. We could talk about the politics of that some other day, but this is one of the few that has been recognized. It was first added in 1989. There's a lot of ongoing conservation efforts that have kept it from going extinct, but it is critically endangered. It's on the knife's edge. So if you look at this map on the left, the historic record ranged from Maine on down into Texas. Kentucky was included. We have some historical records from Western Kentucky that have been of note. And you can see that range that's in light gray, that is the historic range. So that isn't where they live now. The dark gray areas are where they actually still live. So Oklahoma and Arkansas, Nebraska, and then small localities up in New York State. The New York State one is an area where they're actively trying to kind of manage the beetle and increase their population so that we can have this burying beetle well into the future. I just wanted to end by saying, while all of these are weird and creepy to our human senses, we're not out there feeding on blood. We don't live inside of other creatures and drink their lymph fluids. We don't feed our kids regurgitated dead animal material, but these all play active roles in systems. They're decomposers. They are eaten by things. They don't necessarily provide direct benefits to us, but they're a part of the rich tapestry of nature. And they deserve their own space as well. So we need the creepy and the cuddly. We need the weird and the wonderful. I just hope that while we talk about them in this Halloween sense, you get the feeling that they are neat because of this creepiness.
They're definitely creepy. You know, when I asked you for leeches, I'm like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Careful what you ask for.
That one was huge. I couldn't believe it. I was like,
Yeah.
no.
That's one reason I don't know if I ever want to go to the Amazon. Is it just even the earthworms are like they're like cannon shaped.
They just grow everything bigger there. Jonathan, I know once you finish your job as an entomologist, you've got a great job as a movie reviewer as well. So,
oh, cool.
Is there anything you cannot do? I'm good.
I appreciate the opportunity.
No, we always love having you on here. You bring such a interesting perspective. I think a lot of us don't really have that same perspective or that view, and you introduce us to a lot of those creatures that we're unaware of. So I
you
really
don't describe beetles as beautiful or cute.
Well, all creatures, right, are beautiful in their own way. So,
well, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate you joining
always.
us.
Thanks.
So moving on,
it going, I guess, right? So, I know
day.
if you didn't get enough spookiness from that, we've got
right.
So.
We have Dr. Matt Springer. He is joining us to talk about bats.
Hello, yes, and Jonathan mentioned if I had any insight into botflies or stories for botflies this year. And I always get fun emails about botflies. Now I know I should just forward them on to Jonathan to have some answers. But they're common enough that it gets people's attentions, and especially there's a different botfly which I was asking Jonathan about before we started, the nasal botfly that whenever we do deer check stations, and I was teaching class the other day, we were talking about collecting chronic wasting disease samples out of the neck and lymph node of the deer in the classroom, and if you tilt the head up to do that, and out rolls a botfly out of the nasal cavity, which all 30 students jump backwards and what is this? Oh my gosh, So, but they're fun for sure. I think cute and cuddly is a great word for it.
Okay.
That's one way of putting them.
One way of putting it. So I guess with that, in the sense of the theme, I am definitely here to talk about some Halloween-themed wildlife, specifically one in general that has a very strong connection in our folklore, but not so strong a connection to Kentucky. No, not found in Kentucky. But you will see probably a few of them running around on Monday night during trick or treat. So, with that, I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully, everybody, it's working.
Yep.
All right. So it is Wildlife Halloween edition for the show. It is also Bat Week. Go figure. I wonder why Bat Week is strongly related to Halloween time. And that has a lot to do with the connection that we've had in recent history, the last 100 and some odd years, of vampires and bats. And that connection to us seems very strong. It makes a lot of sense. But actually, it's not that history isn't as long-lived as we may expect. There's a substantial amount of folklore, both in Central and South America, about bats' blood, because that's really where our vampire bats, our 3 species of vampire bats, are located. So it makes sense that those who have been living there or have a strong identification with the species that are present and what they do, especially because if you have livestock, vampire bats are going to be using them as a food source. But outside of that area, vampire bats do not exist. There's a New World bat species, like I said, found basically from Mexico down into Argentina. But vampire stories are actually quite common throughout many of the world's cultures. And there's an entire frenzy associated with vampires in the 1700s, and their popularity grew into places where kings were sending inspectors out to small towns to make sure there wasn't an actual vampire in loose. But the behaviors associated with vampire bats and the idea of a vampire would make it very easy to see a connection. But the old mythologies associated with them were actually never connected to a bat specifically, where they had abilities to change into other animals in some cases. Sometimes they were a ghost-like entity that would consume blood and from sleeping individuals. And it wasn't until Bram Stoker's novel Dracula in 1897 where that connection was actually solidified. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Europeans didn't even really know vampire bats existed until the basically mid 1840s, 40s, 50s. But they were first actually identified. Vampire bats were first identified in 1565 when a gentleman who was in Mexico actually had a bat slip into where he was sleeping and start feeding on his toe, which is the most common place for a vampire bat to feed on a human being. Wouldn't be logical, right? But actually, that is the feeding location for most of where they feed on animals. And you'll see some pictures here in a little bit. But that was the first known identification of a bat actually feeding on blood. And there's the species, the common vampire bat species was actually fully described in 1810. But the connection to the fact that the vampire bat that was described in 1810 to the actual idea that that's the bat that consumes blood didn't actually happen until Charles Darwin confirmed it in the 1830s when he saw a bat feeding on a livestock animal. So that was when it actually happened. And then that news kind of made it back to Europe and spread a little bit, where there was a connection between bats and vampires. And finally, the Dracula kind of solidified that connection to what we know now. And if you're really interested in that story, the entire story is kind of written up quite well and is hosted by the Bat Conservation International, which is a great NGO that focuses on education and outreach about bats in general. But they have a nice little thing that was compiled by Dr. McCracken down at University of Tennessee on that entire story about where vampires and bats got that connection and how that exists and where it really came from. But with that, that's my little vampire bat and vampire story. Now, a little bit more about vampire bats, because they're actually really cool and very unique. There's only 3 species in the entire world, and they're all found in Central and South America. They are sanguivorous, which means they do feed on blood, and mainly that was birds and mammals. They were historically, prior to European settlement, existing at very low densities, and that has a lot to do with the fact that they need to consume food at minimum every 2 days. So they need to consume a substantial amount of blood every 2 days. And that has a lot to do with the fact that blood is not a great food resource. It's hard to digest. It's mostly protein, and it's about 80% water. So that is not easy for many animals to deal with. And even as we heard with Jonathan, with leeches and other insects, it's a specialization. But they have evolved it, and it was believed that they actually evolved. Well, the hypothesis is they evolved out of a group of insectivorous bats that consumed a lot more of the blood-consuming insects. And over time, they were able to make adaptations that allowed them to take advantage of that blood that they were consuming, allowing them thus to start consuming a completely different food source in general. Some of the specializations that allow that to happen are things like if you're feeding on an animal, you want to make sure that the animal doesn't know you're feeding, because you need to stay put in one place so you can consume the blood. So they have both anticoagulant, and funny thing is the anticoagulant is called Draculin, which is a nice little connection, as well as a really powerful local anesthetic to make sure the animal can't feel it. That anticoagulant is actually incredibly powerful. It's 20 times more powerful than any of the coagulants that we actually have in medicine today. So it is, they don't need much of a cut to make sure that blood is flowing out of the body of their prey. They have some microbiota present in their digestional tract that help aid both their immune system function as well as to digest that meal as it comes in. And I mentioned that blood is about 80% water. So as these animals are not very big, they're 20 grams to 30 grams usually in size, a couple, maybe wing width of about a foot or so. They will consume almost half their body weight, about a half an ounce of blood in one feeding. And in order for them to consume that and be able to process and get enough food out of it, their kidneys, almost within 2 minutes of digesting blood, of consuming blood, are already urinating out that extra water to allow them to be able to fly when they're done eating, which is really important if you're a bat trying to get away. So that half ounce ish of weight there that they consume is approximately half their body weight. So they're quite impressive. They have several other adaptations that allow them to do this. First and foremost, they have the ability to basically hear and smell living organisms that have blood, which kind of has made it into the many of our stories about vampires now. They have this really cool tongue, because they don't actually drink blood the way we think about vampires in our culture now. They actually will make a slice in the animal, a very small slit, usually a tenth of an inch long at most, and the blood flows out of it, and they actually lick it up with this specialized tongue that has grooves in it that funnels it to the back of their throat. And even to make that split, they have these specialized incisors, these front two incisors that are incredibly sharp, and they're very accurate at making the split where they need to make sure they get that blood to flow out. Compared to other bats, they have some very impressive features that allow them to move around in non-typical ways. So they have a large and very well-developed thumb that allows them to grasp really efficiently. They have incredibly strong hind legs to allow them to jump off the ground and get back in the air after they're done feeding, as well as maneuver away from a very irritated animal that may have found its presence while it is feeding. And then they are, they're all still mammals and vertebrates. So they do potentially have some issues with diseases relative to humans if you do get fed upon by a vampire bat. All those rabies issues still take place. But that digestive system is a little different than what we would normally believe to exist in, say, a carnivorous or insectivorous or any of the fruit-eating bats. So it deals with that extra fluid coming in and kind of sends everything to the kidneys almost immediately, rather than, say, sitting in the stomach as we may think, because they're really just using the red blood cells present in the blood for their food. On top of that, they're one of the few mammals and animals in general that actually exhibit food sharing between adults. It's believed to be a bonding behavior that helps promote positive relations between individuals. They live in colonies, usually anywhere between 30 to 150 individuals. And this is a way for them to actually help probably both form cooperative bonds, as well as aid those individuals that maybe are struggling finding feeding. They could actually share that blood meal with them to potentially help keep them alive. So that's kind of vampire bat. But bats in general, it is Bat Week, so let's talk a little bit about bats that maybe we have in Kentucky too. All of them are mammals. They bear live young. They're called pups. They lactate and have fur just like other mammals. They have this really neat adaptation. They're the only true flying mammal that we have. Flying squirrels just really glide, but they have membranes that are stretched out along their arm and hands that allow them to do that. And they're really a clean animal that unfortunately is a high rabies vector. That's true with vampire bats. It's true with our bats. So that is a risk to humans, but that's really kind of their downfall. But they are a major nighttime pest control mechanism that gives us a great pest control service. And to be honest, one of the things when we lost about 1 million bats with white nose syndrome in North America, we lost about 15 billion tons worth of control of insects because of that one issue alone. The other thing is they vary in size. All right, so I talked about vampire bats that are quite small. The smallest bat is actually a bumblebee bat found in Myanmar. That's about the size of your thumb, all the way up to the largest bat, which is the giant golden crowned flying fox, which is about 4 feet long, or about, if you think about it, it's probably close to the size of a turkey, which is quite big. And in Kentucky in general, we have 15 different bat species. 14 of them are found in our heavily forested region of state in eastern Kentucky. Unfortunately, 5 are currently listed as endangered or threatened, and there's now a proposal to list the tricolor bat, so we may be adding a 6th to that. The other 5 that are currently listed are the Indiana, the northern long-eared, the gray bat, the Virginia big-eared bat, and the southeastern myotis. These all are representative of the species that were hit hardest by white nose syndrome for the most part, and that's kind of been the what pushed them over the cliff in terms of having population crashes. And wrapping this up here, if you're interested in learning more about bats, I mentioned it earlier, but the wonderful resources, Bat Conservation International, they have everything you could ever imagine on bats and bat information. And that's batcon.org is how you can get to that. As well as if you want to learn a little bit more about bats in Kentucky, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources has a web page seen there, and there's some presentations and videos that are listed that talk a little bit about some of the bats that we have in Kentucky that are done by Zach Couch, who was the bat biologist and now the non-game coordinator with Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. So I recommend if you want to learn more about bats, it's a great place to start. On top of that, this is one of the weird behaviors that vampire bats have, that ability to walk. And what they do is they actually land near their prey item, usually a livestock, and they'll use this walking ability to sneak up to the hoofs or feet of the animal, and then proceed to make that little slit and hopefully begin to feed for about 30 minutes to get their blood meal. So with that, I will happily take any questions.
Wow. You know, Matt, if I saw a 4-foot bat, I don't know what I would do. I'm going to be honest with you.
Yeah, they're big. Yeah, those bats are really, they're the ones that we traditionally would think about like hanging in trees, and almost all of those are fruiting bats. Because if you think about how animals fit into nature, they're as big as their food supply can support. And, you know, the fruit is a wonderful resource and is usually very plentiful in the landscape, especially for that. Those flying foxes are tropical, so fruit is almost always readily available. Same with, you know, the vampire bats here are tropical, and you know, there's usually enough animals around that they can find some food. Yeah, they actually existed in very small colonies historically, and now with the advent of livestock agriculture being very dominant across the landscape, their colonies can explode in population, and there have been known for a colony to drain many individual cows of all life-sustaining fluids when they get too high. And unfortunately, it's caused them problems where they'll go out and folks will start poisoning them to knock those populations back.
Wow. Okay.
Thank you, Dr.
They're not here. All
Renee's
right.
still thinking about 4-foot bats.
I'm
So.
still thinking about 4-foot bats. Yeah.
Well, think about the bumblebee bat, the
I
little
like the bumblebee one.
one.
Yeah, I like that one better.
Oh, gosh.
All right.
That's good stuff.
Well, thank you, Matt. We appreciate it.
All right. So
All
now,
right.
I teased this earlier, but
You did.
zombies?
Zombies.
Zombies?
We are. Ellen Crocker is here to talk about zombies.
Yeah, that's definitely what I'm hired to do by the University of Kentucky. I'm the official zombie extension specialist. Here to talk. No, I'm kidding. So normally I talk about forest health stuff, right? But I figured since it's Halloween, we can talk about a special zombie fungus that can terrify you and haunt your dreams.
Well, we're already thinking about 4-foot bats, so why not?
Oh my
4-foot
gosh,
bats.
4-foot bats, zombie fungi. Hopefully you can see a terrifying image on the screen,
Yeah.
attack of the zombie fungus. And this is especially terrifying for any of you out there that are insects. Not so much for those of you that are mammals or humans, but imagine you are an ant in a tropical forest and you are crawling around and minding your own business when unbeknownst to you, spores of a fungus, Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, land on you. And they germinate and they begin growing and penetrate into your body with their hyphae and then grow through your body and take over your body. So this fungus has infected you and changes your behavior. So all of a sudden you start doing things you wouldn't normally. You've been hijacked by this fungus. You leave your nest, you crawl to places that are perfect for this fungus, have the right humidity, the right height. And while this fungus is growing, it is making you do these things until you're in just the perfect spot for it. But then the fungus kills you, and out of your body, a huge fruiting body, at least huge for the ant, not so big for us humans, ruptures from your body, and a tiny little mini mushroom producing hundreds, thousands of spores that will then infect your fellow ants, right? So truly terrifying stuff. But fortunately for us humans, we don't have much to worry about, because while this cordyceps group is commonly called the zombie fungus or zombie fungi, and while they're terrifying to think about in kind of a science fiction perspective, these fungi are not as otherworldly as they might seem on first glance. There are actually different species present within this group and close relatives across forests around the globe. So you can even find those here in Kentucky, although they might be most common in the tropics where they have the highest diversity of insects to feed on. There are different species that are present here as well. And although they might seem terrifying, and certainly if any of those could infect humans, they would be, and would be the stuff of science fiction, they actually serve a really important role in promoting the diversity of insects in those areas. So imagine those fungi that are out there. If any one insect becomes really dominant, too abundant, these fungi and other pathogens could play an important role in kind of keeping them in check. So we might be kind of freaked out by them, as some of our other spooky topics for the day, but they do play an important role, and they are of no threat to us as humans. So the one that you're most likely to find in our area is this one right here, Cordyceps militaris. Here you can see it rupturing out of the body of a larva or a pupa of some kind of moth or butterfly. So you can see the sad victim right here with this fungus fruiting body rupturing out of it. And what this is the mushroom of that fungus that has colonized and eaten that insect. And this is basically the mushroom. So it's producing spores that would then float and infect new victims. Now, many of these cordyceps are thought to have some medicinal value. So in addition to potentially being a positive in our natural areas in terms of promoting diversity of different species, a lot of people think that they have health benefits for us humans as well if we eat them. And you can actually cultivate this one on silkworm larvae. But the most valuable cordyceps and fungus in the world, but certainly cordyceps type species, is this Ophiocordyceps senescens. You might know it as golden cordyceps. And this is not a native to our part of the world, but to Asia. And there it is harvested and sold for a lot of money. So you can find it for sale if you're willing to pay the price. I cannot vouch for any of the health information about that, but it's supposed to support a healthy immune system. Either way, it's another very interesting cordyceps, and this is another one that you might see in our area. You won't see that golden cordyceps, but you might see this Acanthamyces that infects moths, and you can see this poor little moth has been totally covered. Everything white and fluffy there is the fungus that is rupturing out of its dead corpse, stuck to the tree with this dull mat of kind of a yellowish color fungus growth here. All this white fluffy stuff is the fungus mat that's covering the body of that mushroom. And there are lots and lots of different cordyceps, so many different species around the world. Here are just a few cool ones that I found online. Everything from this really disturbing growth on a caterpillar to this poor beetle and more. So there are lots of different ones. And if you are captured by this terrifying idea of zombie fungi, you are not alone. There are lots of different books that are out there exploring the concept of what would happen if there was a cordyceps-like species that could infect humans, take them over, change their behavior. There are several different books and movies about this. Pretty recently, there's The Girl with All the Gifts, a book and a film adaptation. And of course, let us not forget, probably the most famous, the video game The Last of Us has a whole series of zombie-like fungus-infected characters. Here you can see a clicker with its whole head turned into some kind of weird fungal fruiting body, like in this picture here. But rest assured, these fungi are not coming after you unless you are a tiny insect. So that's what we have today on Attack of the Zombie Fungus.
Oh my goodness.
And since I talked a lot about insects, we have Dr. Larson who can comment, but I have a correction because I said they're not coming after you unless you're an insect. There are some species that will infect other fungi, but not humans, so you're safe.
But what if you love bugs and it pains you to see them have eruptions of fungal fruiting bodies?
Well, then you can just know that those who love fungi, I think it's really cool.
I am really happy that you talked about this. I love talking about entomopathogenic fungi in general. Like we talk about Bavaria bassiana a lot as an organic control option. But none of them are quite so spectacular as cordyceps fungi. I mean, all of these other ones, it's like this white scuzzy stuff that gets on them. It really is this spike, right? Like that's what sets this apart. That's what makes it so captivating that people want to turn it into a video game character. It's this idea of like brain control, and then you get this like weird thing that comes out of your body. It's just too much body horror to not be interested in.
Yeah, all the fungal pathogens that actually are bad for humans are not that spectacular in their fruiting bodies. You know, they might be terrible and have really bad health outcomes, and we should totally fear them. Maybe a topic for another show. But this one just looks bad.
Right. Yeah, we get athlete's foot with humans, right?
Yeah, lung infections that are terrible, but they're not going to have big mushrooms fruiting out of you for sure.
And I'm going to have to rethink our creepy things from the forest for next year.
Are you going to put a disclaimer? No human photos, no diseased human photos.
Since it is Halloween and we are at the end of our show, I wanted to try to do something neat. And so we're going to do this right here. And we are in the show. And so we wanted to wish you all a very happy Halloween. We thank you all for joining us today. And again, you can find any of our information on FromTheWoodsToday.com.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.